Whether it's unexplainably cheap German pianos or instruments that are going to make you a ton of money down the road, we've all heard a litany of myths and tricks that people use on new piano shoppers to try and convince them to buy instruments that just aren't what they claim to be. So, in today's video, we've come up with 10 of the most common, ridiculous things that this industry still tends to do sometimes to convince people to buy instruments they probably shouldn't. So the first few all have to do with concealing and misrepresenting where this piano is actually coming from. Now, this problem used to be far worse than it is today, but it still shows up, and not so much from the manufacturer side, but often from insecure or undertrained piano salespeople who just don't really know how to work around the anxieties that some people still have around some countries of origin. And usually we're talking about Asian countries. Today the risk is less about not getting a quality product, it's more about just straight up misrepresentation. You think you're getting a German piano and it turns out to be Chinese. And how this typically comes up is that the country of origin will simply be avoided in any specific language within the showroom, either on a tag or when prompted in conversation with your piano salesperson. They'll use ambiguous language such as German heritage or German engineering. Often they'll highlight the fact that it's using German components. The important thing to remember here is that pretty well any piano on earth has German heritage, because that's where the piano was invented. And a lot of the parts manufacturers still have ties to German parent companies or companies that have business in Germany. And so it's really easy to mix and match the word Germany and a lot of these other components without having to say the piano was made in Germany. So how to avoid this? Go and locate the country of origin tag that's going to be present on pretty well all new pianos, both digital and acoustic. So let me show you where country of origin tags are typically located on both grands and uprights so that you know where to find them and not get caught by this. The other way to ensure that you're not receiving Asian product that's being passed off as European is just to do a bit of a reality check with the price point. Any European grand piano is going to start at a minimum of around 30,000 US dollars for the smallest, least expensive European product, and most are going to be in the $50,000 to $100,000 range. If we're talking about upright pianos, European uprights are going to start around the $20,000 mark and go up from there. If you're looking at a grand as being offered to you for $15,000 to $20,000 and being presented as a European-made product, you know that something's not quite right. So second on the list is related to the first one, and I'm going to call this the value-added scam. And I saw one just the other day pop up on Facebook, and that's what made me include it on this list today. You see, some countries only require that more than 50% of the value that has gone into the instrument to get it to the point of sale happen within that particular country. But that can be any mix of labor as well as parts and construction. A small company will start up and claim to be making an instrument in the United States, or whatever the case may be. And in fact, all they're actually doing is importing unbranded products, often from China, and then bringing them into a small shop and essentially just prepping them to death. Occasionally adding a few extra things like a new set of hammers or replacing bass strings, but very often inflating the value of that prep so that it exceeds the 50% mark of the overall cost of the instrument. And then, legally speaking, they could put that this has now been made in the UK or made in Germany. Now, the easiest way to catch this is that factories are pretty hard to hide. If there's any suspicion in your mind, just Google the factory. If it is where it says it is, you're going to see large buildings, you're going to see industrial infrastructure, there's going to be images and photos of something going on inside the factory or outside the factory, and if you can't find any, in combination with the suspicion you probably already had, there's a good chance that they may be pulling this value-added scam and improperly applying a made-in tag to this instrument. Now, my third point is how to spot a stencil brand and understand the risks involved with it. Now, what do I mean by stencil brand? Well, these are instruments that often leave large reputable factories without any branding on them whatsoever and are sold to small importers or smaller distributors who then apply their own branding and serial numbers to these. This can cause significant amounts of problems down the road when you're either trying to repair the instrument or resell the instrument. Now, why is repair an issue? Well, because that warranty that you're getting isn't from the factory. The warranty is only as good as that small distributor or importer is in terms of their ability to stay in business and make good on their promises to you. And in terms of resale value, looking up a serial number or determining that piano's true origin, either the country, the factory it came from, or the year it was imported, is going to be virtually impossible. And so creating confidence with another person who's trying to buy this instrument off you is going to be incredibly difficult, especially when they're going to have instruments like used Kawais and Yamahas to choose from on the marketplace as well. So how to spot this? Well, there's a few ways. For one, because they're leaving the factory often without the label, or the label is an afterthought, you'll usually be able to actually see the gold label on top of the clear coat, and sometimes it's literally just a sticker. Now, this doesn't automatically make it a stencil brand, but it increases the chances that that's what's happened. And two, simply Google the brand name. If the brand name doesn't have a factory directly associated with it, and you can't really trace this down to anything more than, say, a P.O. box in Delaware, there's a good chance that this brand only exists as a licensed name and there really isn't a factory standing behind the warranty or any of the records that go along with it. So next is the myth of the appreciating piano. The idea that you can somehow buy an instrument and almost be guaranteed to make money or certainly not lose any value on it down the road. This, regardless of the brand we're talking about, is a thoroughly debunked myth. And so any piano salesperson who tries to get into this line of thinking or argument behind justifying a price or a brand, you can swiftly ignore. The brand that's probably most famously associated with this line of thinking is Steinway. Now, while I don't believe that's really an official part of Steinway's sales presentation anymore, it still persists in the mythology of the brand. That you buy a Steinway and at some point in the future, you'll be able to sell it for a profit, or certainly it will appreciate as an investment. The reality is that there's really only two scenarios in which machines that are collectible ever appreciate in value. And that is if there's an incredibly limited number of them and if it tends to have significant historical or cultural importance. And a garden variety Steinway or any other piano doesn't really meet either one of those tests. Besides, as a piano, it's slowly wearing down and constantly being replaced with instruments that are coming out year after year. So while it might be true that some pianos, Steinways or otherwise, might sell for more than the numeric value that you bought them for decades later, it never keeps pace with inflation, and often it is depreciating the same as a Kawai or a Yamaha might. So next on my list is something I'm going to refer to as false positioning, and this is also quite common. And the gist of this trick is that you're going to put the instrument that you'd like to sell to a large number of customers next to a piano that appears to be far more expensive but less impressive musically. And this is done to accentuate, artificially so, the perceived value of your prize piano. The other thing that often is done in conjunction with some pricing optics as well as under-prepping and over-prepping instruments is also the physical position in the room. Perhaps the instrument that's being proposed is better lit or is in a better acoustic situation in a room versus the other one, which is being used to create the idea that this instrument is really well priced and a great prize that you just can't miss out on. The reality is if pianos are equally prepped and there to be presented in an apples to apples fashion, then as you go up in price, almost without fail, those instruments should objectively be all getting better. You shouldn't be running into obvious deficiencies like one is in tune or one is out of tune, or one has some unexplained buzzing or knocking and the other one doesn't. So if you come across a piano you really like and you feel like its value is being propped up by comparisons to more expensive instruments in the room. Do yourself a favor and make sure that those more expensive instruments aren't speaking to you because of super obvious deficiencies in their prep. Make sure they're in tune, make sure that the keys feel like they should, and then if you're still resonating with the less expensive instrument, well, then that might just be your subjective preference. Next is what I call the riddle of the 4 R's. Is a piano restored, reconditioned, refurbished, or rebuilt? 4 words that are used almost interchangeably sometimes when we're talking about used instruments, but they actually have quite specific meanings, and if the dealerships are using them appropriately, can have vastly different implications to what the piano should cost and what you should be expecting out of its performance. Sometimes it's not even the dealer that's trying to misrepresent the instrument. Sometimes it's a lack of understanding on the part of the salesperson in terms of what all of these words mean. So let's start with reconditioned. In the piano world, reconditioned can literally mean wiping down an instrument to get rid of fingerprints and taking the instrument in from, say, a rental or a very, very short stay in a customer's home and basically changing its condition back to something that can be sold as new and re-warrantied. That is enough to call an instrument reconditioned. Very little, if any, physical work or remedial action needs to be taken on that instrument for it to qualify for that word. So if somebody is claiming an instrument is reconditioned and really putting a lot of value and emphasis on it, I would be a little bit cautious. Refurbished actually has a little bit more meat to it. Refurbished could be an instrument where there's not really any significant replacement of parts or any significant reconstruction of the instrument, but where there has been a significant amount of work by high-level technicians going in and doing voicing regulation, perhaps fixing some glue joints, perhaps resolving specific performance issues such as a dead bass string, maybe going and repolishing and fixing up and cleaning up the trap work or the pedals. It could mean a number of things, but refurbished generally speaks to a much higher level of work by a skilled worker who's gone in and changed the dynamics and performance of an instrument to be at a different level than it was before. So third is rebuilt. And for me and most technicians that I speak to, rebuilt indicates that we've had major replacement of critical components to bring the instrument back to a factory level of performance. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's been an emphasis on replacing those parts with the exact same part as the original, but the point has been to get the instrument back to a highly functional place that resembles the same kind of performance that you would have experienced on that instrument had it been new. And so rebuilt is a different level of investment, of spend by a rebuilder or a retailer to get it up, much different than refurbished and a world away from reconditioned. Finally, last on our list is restored. You're not going to see this word used very often because in reality it isn't happening very often. And the distinction for me is basically you're talking about a rebuilt instrument, but the purpose is to completely bring it back to original factory spec. So not only are you going through and making sure that all the components are replaced and that they are at the original condition and performance level, but that there has been every attempt to use original parts that returns the hammers, the strings, the soundboard, everything back to how it would have been the day you bought that instrument. It's a very difficult standard to achieve, and sometimes one, honestly, that doesn't have any musical merit, but for people who are interested in collectability, this is critical. If you are searching for used, and specifically high-ticket used, it's really important to understand those 4 words and make sure that they're being used appropriately and make sure that it gets put in writing on a contract if there's been a claim of one of those 4 levels. So next is the myth of MSRP. Nobody pays MSRP, particularly in the piano industry, particularly with acoustic pianos, and specifically in North America. There's been a tradition that goes back 120 years in this business of inflating MSRP so that customers can get gigantic, unrealistic discounts on their instrument so that they can feel excited about buying the piano. But we now have resources and tools so that customers have a much better way of gauging the kind of discount or pricing that they are receiving on their piano. Resources like pianobuyer.com came up with a formula called suggested maximum price that's actually connected to the wholesale price that dealers pay. And in smaller markets and smaller dealerships, SMP actually represents a pretty fair price to both the seller and the buyer. Now, obviously, when you get into larger competitive markets and dealerships that have a lot of buying power, S&P may represent a high watermark in terms of where you want to be, but at least there's a connection between it and wholesale. So it can be useful as an apples to apples comparison between stores or other brands. But most meaningfully, that really is your starting point in terms of negotiating any kind of a discount with your dealer. So any dealer who's trying to use MSRP to justify the discount they're offering is really doing so from a very inauthentic place. Now, I'm going to add a caveat. If we go over to Europe, we actually find that MSRP is a far more meaningful number, and the traditional discounts off that MSRP are fairly minimal. German piano buyers, for example, are thrilled to get a 5% discount off MSRP. To an American shopper, that would seem insane. So as the world shrinks and people start doing more and more price comparisons outside of their own country, it's really important to remember that pianos aren't necessarily cheaper in Europe than they are in North America. It's just that the MSRP is less inflated. Next is something that doesn't get talked about very much, the piano bench. When you're in a showroom, when you're in front of an instrument, when you're taking a look at the bench, when you're sitting, you're getting comfortable, it's very important for you to be aware of the bench that you're sitting on and whether that's in fact the bench that is going to be delivered to your home. Ask the question, be very specific, and make sure that it's articulated on the contract that you draw up with your dealer, because it is a common thing to have more expensive, more comfortable benches sitting in front of showroom pianos than what you're actually going to receive at home. So make sure it's not an afterthought. Do ask the bench that you're getting and make sure that you've had a chance to see and sit on the bench that's being included. And of course, if it's not sufficient, then have the open conversation about upgrading yourself to something that you're going to be really thrilled to sit on. And my last point is to make sure that every critical detail that's been promised to you and discussed winds up in writing. I can't tell you how many times I heard about salespeople making commitments and just never delivering on it, and their excuse has always been that it was never written down, or the dealership that did the deal isn't prepared to honor it because there's no proof it was ever said. This can be stuff as small as 1 tuning versus 2 tunings in terms of what's been included, up to things that are far more substantial like country of origin or whether delivery's been included or not. So make sure you protect yourself, make sure that all major commitments that have been discussed over the course of the buying process are clearly articulated in writing so that everybody can feel comfortable and everybody's got a reference document to go back to if there's any disagreement or misunderstanding down the road. So thank you so much for watching our fresh list of 10 tricks that you need to know about so that you can avoid them and have a great shopping experience. My name is Stu Harrison. It's been Merriam Pianos on YouTube. Really appreciate you watching. Please hit that subscribe if you want to come back for more, and we'll see you again soon.